Sure.
Here we go.
Hi. I read the index and I didn't see the word gentrification, though I did see the word unslumming. And I wondered what your thoughts were. You go to a lot of urbanism meetings and people lament gentrification and they wonder what are the solutions. So what are your thoughts?
I worked so hard on that index. How did we leave out gentrification? It's funny, San Francisco interviewer asked me the same question today. I suppose I'm going to get it everywhere. I think one has to understand gentrification is a very complicated word. It's not just what everybody complains about in terms of Soho or any other upscale neighborhood. There's a national phenomenon here. There's a whole shift in our economy, our upward shift, the emphasis on expensive products, expensive places, the world of finance versus the world of real mixed economic uses. So that, as we all know, in the whole current economic confusion, not just downturn, we know how the division between low and high has gotten further apart. So you've got more money up here ready to spend in more places. That's one aspect. Number two, there's good gentrification and there's bad gentrification. And the good gentrification comes in the neighborhoods that would literally disappear without it, where there's lots of vacant housing, dilapidated buildings, places that once functioned well and need to be reused. The question is, at what point do you put in the stops? In my first book, I wrote about policies actually citizen-initiated in Savannah, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and a few other places, where at the early point in the process, a certain amount was locked in that could not be upscaled, could not be lost as affordable or low income. We don't do that as a policy. We talk about it. We hear a lot of complaints about gentrification. There are a whole slew of policies that could apply to it. In fact, one even I wrote my second book where I wrote about the Soho syndrome and talked about the whole how Soho really happened. One of the things in Soho that is locked in, and at one point the Planning Commission tried to undo it, but fortunately didn't. There's a square footage. There's a limitation on how a store can expand. You can't you can't take a Soho block and knock all the walls down between stores to have a big box. That's a zoning issue that guarantees, sure, we have a lot of, stuff in Soho that people don't like. Some of it is disappearing in this economy. And some of it is expensive but may be individually owned. So there are ways to work at guaranteeing certain things. Ironically, as much as people talk about the gentrification of Harlem, if you were to take a survey of Harlem, you have an enormous source of public housing and permanent low-income housing owned and developed by the city or local organizations. There are a lot of community-based groups around this city that develop, take over old buildings and develop low-income co-ops or low-income, rentals. So I think we need to have a discussion, not just whether good gentrification is good or bad, but what is it really? How many layers need to be unraveled?
Hi, I was raised in the Bronx in the shadow of the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway. I'm also privileged to sit on the board of the Historic Districts Council, so I know where you're coming
Were
from.
you displaced by the express?
No, we weren't. We were close, but we weren't. But when you were reading the litany of small and large, and when you came to the Lincoln Center reference, I assume, that large culture, I was sort of thinking, well, mess as it is in a lot of ways, we're 2 generations, beyond having Lincoln Center, and hasn't it really, in the overall, advanced the prospect of the performing arts in quantity and in quality for New York and the world? I mean, I wonder if that one fits so neatly into that litany.
There are 3 different aspects to that question. Why don't I use this? There are 3. You use it, whatever.
Yeah, okay. I'll just hit it every now and then.
First of all, Lincoln Center, like a lot of other projects that are 50 years old, eventually become part of the fabric of the city. And a lot of housing projects that probably should not have been built are now neighborhoods, with all the networks that an old neighborhood develops of some sort or another. Secondly, where is the real new artistic life of theater and dance? And I don't know about opera, but theater and dance. Where does it take place in this city? It moves to Lincoln Center. It doesn't start at Lincoln Center. It's not an incubator for the arts. The incubators for the arts are in Brooklyn or the Lower East Side or in the Bronx. They're around the city. They're not at Lincoln Center. And the problem is that when you need a new theater, which in fact, that would be questionable in some cases. Remember, Carnegie Hall was supposed to be torn down for Lincoln Center. The old Met was torn down for Lincoln Center. Each of those theaters, in and of themselves, could have been an anchor in a neighborhood, like the Joyces, like BAM, although BAM is growing enormously. But each function could have, in its own way, been a real contributor to a neighborhood instead of an island in it. I live 2 blocks away. It's murder to live there, because between the traffic and when I want to go out to dinner, I can't go till after dinner, after a curtain call. There's not a store, that fits a local community. I now live in a mall because I've got them all up there. I've got Best Buy, West Elm, all these things. So, sure, now we love Lincoln Center for all sorts of reasons, but also look at the enormous, really incalculable amount of money that is now going in to redoing Lincoln Center to connect it to the city. The first being Juilliard, and terrific. The fact is, it was at great expense. It destroyed a neighborhood that was not a slum. And I go to great lengths in the book and quote a really terrific Brooklyn activist who lived on that site and the impact on her family from that clearance. Extraordinary expense on many levels to build it, and now and several times redoing Avery Fisher. Okay, it is an unending expense that really should have been avoided. And as far as the arts are concerned, we could have had each one of those theaters in a separate location serving the same purpose.
With your talk about Lincoln Center, the phrase white elephant comes into mind. I wanted to ask about, I read once that Moses had a plan to build a freeway across Soho and that it was defeated. Can you describe the mechanism by which it was defeated?
Well, there's a lot. I wrote about this in my last book, but I have conversations with Jane about this in this book. And we're standing right where the expressway would have been. The expressway would have wiped out what we now know as Soho, Little Italy, and Chinatown. And it would have connected the West Side Highway with East Side Highway and taken people out of the city. And, you know, you have to remember at that time, the idea cities were places that you went through or went out of. The thought of staying in a city was not a popular notion. It wasn't even in the 70s, 60s, I would say. 70s started turning. But Jane was clearly the formidable citizen leader there. She was brought to a meeting, she was called to a meeting by a minister, I forget which church it is. She had just come through the fight the urban renewal fight in the West Village. And her book had just been published, 61, or wasn't yet published, but was finished. And she resisted going at first. The last thing she wanted was one more, energy-draining fight. But she went, and she got very involved, and I never witnessed this, but from people who I've heard speak, she was very charismatic. She basically had very strong views on how to lead a citizen effort, and they were steadfast, stubborn. There's a bit in the book on why she hates Nelson Rockefeller and how she followed him around during a San Gennaro festival with a bullhorn, asking him, why do you want to, she just went after them. And I can't say that would have been enough. But they went through a whole series of things, using the law, doing research, exposing things that were untruths. And there was a very important element here, which we don't have today, and that was the Village Voice. Mary Nichols of the Village Voice was just totally in Jacob's camp. In fact, she started at the Village Voice to write about it because the daily press paid very little attention to these issues. And the Voice was out there. And so the public, the press was on top of it. So it's a whole accumulation of things. And eventually, there were some political victories along the way and some somewhat comical political, failures. She got arrested, and I have the whole thing in which she describes her arrest in the book. So it's a very instructive battle to learn from, but all these battles were. And they're not different from a lot of the battles today.
I'm going to hit you an easy one.
He's a friend.
The current and previous architecture critics of the New York Times and others have described New York as dangerously over-preserved at the moment. Too much preservation is stifling creative new buildings and even the city's vibrancy itself. Want to take that one on?
I sure do. I thought you might. He serves with me on the Landmarks Commission. I want to know what city they're talking about. To start, there's not a place in this city where there isn't new construction. I mean, there was a point, I started hearing this, at times you would go around the city, there were cranes everywhere. What city were they talking about? That's number one. Number two, look at the most desired, well-functioning districts in this city. They're all historic, designated historic districts. And look at some of the best new buildings that have been built in the last 5, 6, 7 years. They all came through and were approved by and made better because they went through the Landmarks Commission. The stuff we don't like, whether it's Trump on the outside of a district or some other monstrosity, are out of these things. So preserved is, what does that mean? Does it mean that a lot of the upgraded old buildings that people are living in, $1 million apartments, because they're old buildings, that's too preserved? Those apartments are better than anything new that gets built today. So it's just a question that totally puzzles me. Because, to start, I don't know what city they're talking about.
Hi. I've lived in Soho for 30 years. My friends here.
You haven't been
40,
pushed
50
out?
years. No. I live on Charlton Street. Nobody found out about Charlton Street till about 5 years ago. And now, of course, we have to deal with Trump. But our biggest problem is NYU. Really is. I mean, I hate Trump. It's the biggest eyesore. But NYU is a destroyer, and I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Question I was going to ask.
I say a lot about this in the book, which is just going to make you buy it, I hope. It's a larger issue. I think, first of all, let me say, the real question is not just NYU. It's all the educational institutions, the hospitals, the institutions of the city that get favored treatment in zoning, in landmarks, in incentives and whatever. Community facilities get special dispensation in all sorts of ways. They've become like corporations. And it's not the NYU I went to. I worry about this because the voice of this neighborhood is really stifled because too many people living here live in NYU real estate. But I have to say it's not just NYU, it's a larger issue. I don't know why NYU needs to create all the housing that it claims to need, except unless they make a lot of money out of it. I mean, I went to NYU. I lived at 83rd and Central Park West and got on the subway and came to class. So they claim, well, students can't get apartments. Well, part of the reason is because they bought everything else up. And, so the prices all go up. I don't know what the answer is. I know what the problem is. And the problem is that universities are becoming something other than what we understand them. And this is true in other cities. It's not just New York. And I do think that somewhere along the line, something's got to give. I do think also that I'd say in the go-go 90s, when there was all this big money around and everybody wanted their name on a building, so a lot of buildings got built or named at the same time that they might have been cutting the number of professors or cutting this or making the size of classes bigger. I have one daughter who went to Cornell where this same thing was happening. So I think it's a national issue. It just, it plays out here in a very dramatic way because this is the star of a neighborhood, of an urban neighborhood nationally. The Village has a connotation beyond any other neighborhood in the country, and when it is fully owned and occupied by NYU, it is a different place.
Time for one more. Oh, that worked. Okay, just give it a hit. Here you go.
Hi there. I live in Prospect Heights in Brooklyn, where the new Nets Center and the superstructure giant whatever things are about to be built, the skyscrapers. And, the community effort basically has been, we lost, basically, perhaps broken. Pretty sad. But I think the hardest part is the privatization of public domain. I mean, it's a stadium that's going to profit some individuals, and I wonder if you had thoughts about the privatization of public domain.
First, let me say that I go into great length as to why Atlantic Yards is out of the Robert Moses drawer. It's in the conclusion of the book. Atlantic Yards, Columbia, and Willets Point are the Moses examples. Transportation, urban agriculture, and preservation are the Jacobs, with the idea of showing that we have both. Nobody should think we have one or the other. There is no public process left in this city. It's a joke. It's all through the state. Empire Zone, state economic... State development, thank you. And the hearing process and the public process is a joke. As far as public input, which occasionally, the city likes to boast there is, it doesn't exist. It's... a real public participation process involves people, the public, before a pencil hits paper. There was the beginning of it, and it went nowhere. It was a joke. It was a palliative after 9/11, when they gathered thousands of people at tables. The public came all over, so interested in being part of a process of what should happen on ground zero. Every table had a pencil and paper. People really took it seriously. And it's really quite tragic when you think that it's all in some archive. There is no real participation unless it's something that emerges out of the community to start. Instead, what happens is a plan is developed, either mostly by a developer who then takes it to the planning commission, who then takes it to the community and asks for community participation, resulting in community packages of community benefits, which in my mind are just payoffs and never adequate because they don't change anything. So my definition of public process does not happen. And I think this is a perfect example in Atlantic Yards. And then the notion that they designed Atlantic Yards somewhere early in the process with Jane Jacobs in mind, because they put some streets, even though they curve, and they put some retail on the ground floor and a park, and such a misinterpretation of Jacobs. It's very sad and unfortunate. I don't think, and then it never happens the way it finally passes. Atlantic Yards won't be built the way it was presented. It won't even be half as good as it might have been if it had gone through a real design process. The other thing I just have to add to that is this notion that the city is now, it's all about NIMBY. And I hear this in other cities as well. First of all, I then want to know what city they're talking about when they say it's all NIMBY and you can't get anything done.
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard. And I go to great length in the book to show all the very big things that are getting done without Robert Moses. But I reject the not in my backyard term 100%, unless you show me there's not a community-based alternative proposal. NIMBY only applies in those communities where they want nothing, offer no alternative, and just say leave. I have not found the community that responds to today's issues that reacts that way. Usually, you don't necessarily read about it in any sense of the word. There was a very well thought out alternative plan to Atlantic Yards, to Columbia, to Willets Point, to everything. So NIMBY is a false accusation promulgated by the powers that be, who will tell you, you can't get anything done in this city. We need another Robert Moses. And I reject all of that on a factual basis, not just an argument basis.
One more question.
What do you think What do you think of Battery Park City?
Battery Park City, it's interesting because in my first book, I said something about Battery Park City that I would take back today, because it is not well connected to the city. However, it was a real attempt to learn from and replicate the city in a way, in at least only in a residential and commercial way. There's no real mixed use. It's resident commercial, but it has the feel of a real urban place, albeit a new one. In my mind, it is very hard. I think, if anything, Battery Park City proves that you can't build a new place and have the feeling of an authentic city. Certainly not by one developer. I don't believe any place can be built by one developer and be authentic, because an authentic city is built by many different people at different times for different purposes and in different segments. So certainly it's better than a lot of other kind of places, but it's hard to say more in that respect. And interestingly enough, it attracted as tenants very much early on, I don't know about today, a lot of out-of-towners, suburbanites moving back into the city. It has that feeling of suburban security or something. So it's got its pros and cons, but it's a lot better than what they were going to try to do at Atlantic Yards.
Okay. There's this there. I'm going to just sort of conclude this. We got to sell some books.
I'll sign books.
But your reply a moment ago, struck me because I think the profundity of the book and of Jane Jacobs' work and of this issue lies in the fact that it really isn't just an urban issue. It's a civic issue. It's a profound civic issue. You say the public process in New York is defunct. Well, the public process nationally is defunct. What you talk about not working in this city also doesn't work nationally. And we can extend this to the institutions of higher learning that we've been talking about. These universities, and I work for NYU, are corporations that don't listen to the faculty, they manage the faculty. Johns Hopkins University, where I taught before, is another example. Just like NYU, if you go down to Baltimore, you'll see a few square miles of East Baltimore devastated, empty. It's a ghost town because they're going to tear it all down to expand the medical school campus, because that's a moneymaker. That's huge. Well, I can tell you that the faculty at Johns Hopkins matters as much to management there as the faculty at NYU or Columbia or any of these other places matters. So this is really, this is an issue of tremendous profundity. And cities are, exquisitely democratic entities when they work properly. So I thank you for.
I have to add one thing, and this is not a plug. It's real, and my colleague and friend here, Fred Bland, serves with me on the Landmarks Commission. We do have a public process at the Landmarks Commission. We do listen to public testimony, and every week, and even today in a couple of cases, our opinions were shaped by the people who testified. The public process really works when we let it work. it's not that they told us what to do, but their information and point of view informed our decision. And we made the decision accordingly, but it was a real process. And in a larger way, that's what's missing, is really listening. The story in the book where Jane gets arrested, and it's all kind of wonderful because I included it in the appendix. It's a total verbatim, her words of her arrest. Happened at a public hearing where when they got there, the podium, instead of like this, facing the state officials who were supposed to be there to listen, was facing the audience. And she said, "This is a sham. We don't need to talk to ourselves. We're here for you to listen." And of course, there were no state officials to really listen anyway. And because of that, she said to everybody, she said to a few people, and everybody followed, "I'm the new, I want them to take a message back to Albany. Let's walk across the stage." And everybody followed, and they walked across the stage, and there's this wonderful description of the stenotypist panicking. These people, these, fierce people were coming up. So she grabs the steno machine, the paper goes flying, and the tape goes all over the place, and they walk across, and Jane declares, "Well, there's no public hearing, there's no public record, and so this is all, a sham." And then she gets arrested for public, riot or something. I can't even remember. And she goes through this whole thing with getting booked and the whole 9 yards. But her point was, there was no one there to listen. They weren't interested in the public input. They knew what the decision was, and that happens today. So, however, I did want to put in a plug for landmarks, of which I can be critical, but at least in this case, every week I marvel and I'm pleased to be part of something where I see that I and my colleagues are influenced by the people who come on a weekly basis to testify.
Thank you for that. Do buy a copy of The Battle for Gotham. Have Roberta sign a copy of it. Thank you so much. This was really, really a marvelous event. Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Now you can clap.